been 2 decades since attacks of September 11, 2001, a day that forever altered the trajectory of our nation, of the whole world. In the intervening years, America fought 2 wars, hunted down those responsible, and has sought to remain vigilant against future attacks. In this special edition of Hold the Line, we ask an important question. 20 years later, are we safer as a nation?
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
Welcome to Hold the Line. I'm Buck Sexton. 20 years since the 9/11 attacks. The official anniversary, of course, is tomorrow. This weekend, there are a lot of ceremonies, a lot of people that will be remembering that day. It's one that affected all of us who were alive then. It still affects those to this day who weren't even born yet. Led to an expansion of what was then a nascent war on terror into 2 full-scale wars, as well as military and paramilitary operations involving the intelligence community of the U.S. and allied nations all over the world. But when we look at what's happened in the last 20 years, we also see a trajectory that's very troubling. Because today, how much safer are we really after all those wars, after all the fighting, than we were back on September 11th, 2001? I remember the day very clearly still. I was in college. I had just gone to my first class, 8:30 in the morning, and one of the planes had hit the Twin Towers. And as I went back to my room and sat there with friends of mine, classmates of mine, we saw the second plane hit in real time on television. And I remember saying out loud, we are going to war. It was clear right away this was a massive terror attack and that we were in the midst of something that we had not seen since the attack on Pearl Harbor. So in the aftermath of that, the country had a lot of unifying to do, healing to do, but also we had to go on offense, and we did. This led to the invasion of Afghanistan and then the even more controversial decision to invade Iraq thereafter. What is it now that we should be thinking about in terms of the lessons learned from preventing a terror attack like this? What can we say about all of this in retrospect? Well, we know that there were bureaucratic mishaps. We know that there was a lack of communication, stovepiping of intelligence, ineptitude on a massive scale that led to 9/11. Then there was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the National Counterterrorism Center, an enormous surge in federal funding for all kinds of counterterrorism programs in major cities, fusion centers involving local police and federal agents all across the country. We remember that George Bush, back on October 26th, George Bush signed the Patriot Act. Here's what that was.
Today, we take an essential step in defeating terrorism while protecting the constitutional rights of all Americans. With my signature, this law will give intelligence and law enforcement officials important new tools to fight a present danger. I commend the House and Senate for the hard work they put into this legislation. Members of Congress and their staffs spent long nights and weekends to get this important bill to my desk. I appreciate their efforts and bipartisanship in passing this new law.
Did it stop more mass casualty attacks? We didn't get hit with another on the scale of 9/11, but we were hit with many terrorist attacks in the aftermath in the 10 years, 15 years after the 9/11 attacks, largely by ISIS and homegrown extremists. Are we better situated to defend ourselves against them now? And what should we make of the fact that Afghanistan is, just as it was 20 years ago, back in the hands of the Taliban, a group that has deep ties to Al-Qaeda itself, as well as other extremist jihadist entities in the region. Are we safer? Are we better off? We'll address that question together today. We got a great lineup of guests for you, starting with a man who was on the front lines on that fateful day of September 11, 2001. Former Commissioner of the New York City Police Department, Bernard Kerik, joins us when we come back. The September 11th terrorist attacks left the United States with a national trauma, and in no place is that trauma more acutely felt than New York City. Over 2,600 people perished that day in the World Trade Center, including hundreds of firefighters and police officers. In the wake of the devastation, the New York Police Department would take a prominent role in the efforts to prevent future attacks on the homeland. So 20 years after the attack that shook the country, is New York City any safer? Bernard Kerik was commissioner of the NYPD on September 11, 2001. He joins us now to give his thoughts on this solemn 20-year anniversary. Good to see you, Bernie. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Buck.
So just take us through your mind, if you can, on what the events of that day were like for you as the commissioner of the NYPD.
Well, when the first plane hit Tower 1, I was actually in my office, which is only about a quarter of a mile away from the towers. I called the mayor, told him that a plane had just hit the tower. I was on the way to our command center. The city's command center at the time was inside 7 World Trade, directly across the street from Tower 1. So I went down to get into Tower 7, and the police were stopping traffic on Vesey and West Broadway. I got out of the vehicle, and I watched the debris come down off the building, and I realized when that debris got closer to the ground, it wasn't debris, it was humans. And I watched, I guess, over the next 4 or 5 minutes, probably a couple dozen people jump to their death. While I was there waiting for the mayor, the second plane slammed through the north side of Tower 2 right on top of me. So my staff and I got out of the way, went behind Tower 7. That orange fireball that you see now on the screen, I'm standing underneath that, directly in front of that building, looking up, not knowing, Buck, what happened at the time, because that plane came from the southern portion of Manhattan and blew out the north side of the tower. But I could hear the pilots yelling that a second aircraft just hit Tower 2. So that was the beginning, pretty much, of my day, with Giuliani arriving, the mayor arriving about minutes later.
What was it like then to try to coordinate those on the ground, both evacuation and rescue efforts as the towers were coming down?
You know what? It wasn't as difficult as people may think, only because from 1996 up into 2001, in 1996, Mayor Giuliani created the Office of Emergency Management in New York City, which gave us the ability for every city agency to communicate and coordinate together in the event of a crisis. On this day, we responded as we would to any crisis, and we had planned, we had drills and table for every crisis you could imagine, with the exception of somebody using planes as torpedoes to fly them into those buildings. But the response capabilities, the response protocols and plans, they were all intact. Everybody did what they were supposed to, and here's the outcome, Buck. And I want your listeners and viewers to think of this. The men and women in the New York City Police Department, the Fire Department, and the Port Authority Police on 9/11 effected the greatest rescue mission in the history of this country. They took between 20 and 25,000 people out of those buildings, but they also evacuated close to 1 million people into the 4 boroughs and into New Jersey, and they did it flawlessly, according to the plans and protocols that were in place over the prior 5 years.
Bernie, what do you say to people you come across who, particularly the family members of NYPD and FDNY, Fire Department of the City of New York, who lost loved ones on that day? I mean, what are those conversations like, and what do you say to them?
Well, listen, first and foremost, my heart goes out to them. Many I knew personally. Many I knew personally. Um, but I often thank them, not only for the sacrifice, not only for the sacrifice that their families made, but I thank them for the inspiration and the motivation for me to get through that day and the aftermath. I had two families, the Vigiano family and the Langone family. They lost a fireman and they lost a cop. Both of those families. And I have to say, the Vigiano family, um, they were, Mr. John Vigiano was a fireman, a retired fireman. He lost two sons, his only two sons. And he was more of an inspiration to me than anything. He kept me going. We kept in communications. We stayed together. Those first several weeks after the event. And this is a guy later. It's ironic, Buck, and you would understand this. I'm standing in the Republican Guard Palace in Iraq in 2003, and I hear somebody yell my name, and I look down the corridor to the dining room, and it was John Vigiano over there on a USO show, spiraling up the troops. They are the people. Those families were everything to me, and still are.
Bernie, I also want to know what you think about the situation of the city of New York as it pertains to preparation for and ability to thwart and/or handle another mass casualty terrorist attack. I mean, are we in a better situation now than we were 20 years ago based on what you know and what you've seen?
Well, I think we're in a lot better circumstance today than we were based on the lessons learned of 9/11, right? In addition to our crisis response capabilities and our localized intelligence, I think we're the only municipal police department in the United States that actually has New York City detectives assigned to areas internationally. For example, we have New York City cops that live in London, in Spain, in Hong Kong, in Jordan, Saudi Arabia. We have New York City detectives all over this world. Why? Because in the event that something happens in one of those countries, I wouldn't want to wait. We don't want to wait for their localized intel to get to Interpol, to get to Scotland Yard, to get to the FBI, to get back to the NYPD, and how it may affect us. No, we want to know now. And that was something that was put in place by Commissioner Kelly. It's a phenomenal tool for us. We're a lot better off than we were. Now, if we can get a new mayor that supports the men and women in the NYPD, we'd really be a lot better off.
Former NYPD Commissioner Bernard Kerik, who was in fact there as the commissioner on September 11, 2001. Bernie, thank you so much for your service to your city and your country on that day and for joining us here to reflect on it with us.
Thanks, Buck.
The nation of Afghanistan became an immediate flashpoint in the war on terror for its role harboring the perpetrators of the September 11th attacks, including their mastermind, Osama bin Laden. Coming up next, we'll talk to senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Bill Roggio about the first offensive in the war on terror and how recent events in that country have undermined American safety.
Last night in Kabul, the United States ended 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. Remember why we went to Afghanistan in the first place? Because we were attacked by Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda on September 11th, 2001. And they were based in Afghanistan. We delivered justice to bin Laden on May 2nd, 2011, over a decade ago. Al Qaeda was decimated. We succeeded in what we set out to do in Afghanistan over a decade ago. Then we stayed for another decade. It was time to end this war.
The terrorist attack on September 11th sparked the beginning of America's longest war. And last month, President Biden ended the war in Afghanistan by pulling all U.S. troops from the country. So what has changed the past 20 years? Well, it's interesting to look at it, isn't it? Today, Islamist terrorists are back in power in Afghanistan. The recent Taliban takeover there came sooner and with more overwhelming success than most of the international community could have ever imagined, certainly faster than the Biden administration expected.
The president did not think it was inevitable that the Taliban were going to take control of Afghanistan.
Was he misled by his own intelligence agencies? Did he not listen to them? Why was he so wrong about that?
The Afghan security forces that we've invested in, the international community's invested in, that force proved incapable of defending the country. And that did happen more rapidly than we anticipated.
In the aftermath of the inevitable Taliban takeover, the main question is whether terrorists will again use Afghanistan as a staging ground the way al-Qaeda did in preparation for the September 11th attacks that changed the world forever. Joining me now to discuss is senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Bill Rogiel. Bill, good to have you back.
Thanks, Buck. Great to be back.
Can you just, by way of review, to put this in the proper context now, as we're looking 20 years back and then, also obviously looking into the future when it comes to the global war on terror, or however people want to phrase it these days, what was the situation from a terror threat perspective on the ground in Afghanistan right before the attacks of September 11th? And what was the state of play over there?
And that's the right question to ask, Buck. On September 10th, 2001, look, first of all, the 9/11 report is commission report is clear on this. Sanctuary for terrorist organizations is their lifeblood. It gives them the ability, time, and space and safety to plot attacks against the West. So on September 10th, 2001, al-Qaeda had safe haven in Afghanistan. 90% of that country was under Taliban control. Al-Qaeda was fighting alongside the Taliban against the Northern Alliance. So there was resistance to the Taliban. And then they operated at the cellular level at several dozens of countries. That'd be Yemen and Somalia and several other countries. But their threat emanating from these countries was not as great as it was in Afghanistan. Today, you have jihadist insurgencies. And these insurgencies, that's how these groups build their strength. They recruit, they fight alongside the local groups, in the case of Afghanistan, the Taliban. And then they select from there, send them to specialized training camps to conduct attacks against the West. Now you have terrorist insurgencies in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Mali. And that's just the al-Qaeda side. And I'm abbreviating it. And you have a rival jihadist group called the Islamic State. And both al-Qaeda and the Islamic State share the same goals: to take over local countries and establish their global caliphate. That is their goal that they share. It's not just the attacks that emanate from these areas and hit us here on American soil. They're trying to build their caliphate. They're doing it emirate at a time. Afghanistan now, again, pre 9/11, 90% of the country, Taliban controlled. Today, it's 100.
Here's President Biden talking about the threat metastasizing beyond Afghanistan. Here's what he had to say.
Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized well beyond Afghanistan. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Nusra in Syria, ISIS attempting to create a caliphate in Syria and Iraq. These threats warrant our attention and our resources. We conduct effective counterterrorism missions against terrorist groups in multiple countries where we don't have permanent military presence. If necessary, we'll do the same in Afghanistan.
Now, does that mean that the situation today is more or less at a high threat level when it comes to the forces of global jihadism and the war on terror than it was 20 years ago? It seems like Biden's making the case that, okay, well, it's well beyond Afghanistan, so don't focus too much on Afghanistan. But doesn't that also mean that there's greater cause for concern? I mean, how do you assess that?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Buck. I mean, he's arguing against himself. He's saying, let's ignore the Afghanistan because the threat is in other places. And yet we do have troops in Syria. We do have troops in Iraq. We have troops based in Africa. But what we don't have now is troops based in Afghanistan, a landlocked country surrounded by adversaries, enemies, or satrapies of Russia. So, how are we safer because Al-Qaeda, and Afghanistan now is the one place that's fully controlled, at least in places like Somalia and in Syria and in Iraq, you have opposition to these groups. In Afghanistan, that opposition does not exist. And neighboring it is a state known as Pakistan that gives state sponsorship to the Taliban. And the Taliban, which is still allied with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is not decimated, done, defeated, degraded, and all the other D words the presidents have said over the last 10 years. It's a viable force that has played a significant role in the Taliban's rise. And that is the reason you don't abandon Afghanistan. Or if you do decide to withdraw, you don't do it the way he did. You put mechanisms in place so that there is opposition to the Taliban.
There was also a bit of a dust-up. A Gold Star mom blasted the White House for calling the Taliban professional. The first word that comes to mind is blasphemous, horribly blasphemous. To call the Taliban that, it's absolutely disgusting, she said. And it's coming from the White House as a Gold Star mother and the voice that represents so many families who have paid the ultimate price for our freedom, and especially those of us whose loved ones took their last breath in Afghanistan. It's embarrassing. It's completely embarrassing, disappointing, like living in the Twilight Zone. Unbelievable. This is White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki defending the White House, calling the Taliban businesslike and professional.
Can you explain a little bit more about why the White House in a statement is calling the Taliban businesslike and professional? Their interior minister has an FBI wanted poster.
We are here to celebrate the return of American citizens who wanted to leave Afghanistan, of legal permanent residents, of Afghans who fought by our side. In order to get those people out, we had to work with some members of the Taliban to press them and to work in a business-like manner to get them out.
Bill, what do you make of this? It seems like the Biden administration is more than just a little open to the idea that the new Taliban is going to be a whole lot better than the old one.
Yeah, except the new Taliban is the old Taliban. Most of the new Taliban leaders served with the Taliban from 1996 to 2001. To call them, look, I would actually agree. The Taliban are professional. They're professional terrorists. They have a professional military that has reaped the benefits of U.S. supplied weapons that they've seized. But it's not professional and business like the administration says. The administration and U.S. military officials have been completely tone deaf. Look, President Biden called this a success. What was I forget? He's an extraordinary success. I don't know of anyone who thinks this was an extraordinary success outside of the Biden administration. General McKenzie, the commander of CENTCOM, calls them our Afghan partners. When you view them like that, then you think you could do business. They're doing business with terrorists. I'm being told that there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars being exchanged per American that's leave. I haven't been able to confirm that, but I heard that from a very, very good source, and I have no doubt that it's true.
Bill, always good to have your expertise and insights here, sir. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Buck. Always a pleasure, sir.
In the wake of September 11th, America's intelligence community was forced to refocus its attention on preventing new attacks and holding those responsible to account. Coming up, we'll be joined by former U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel and Intelligence Officer Tony Shaffer to discuss how 9/11 reshaped American intelligence and whether or not they're prepared for the next attack. 20 years after the September 11th attacks, one question still haunts us. Could it all have been prevented? Well, according to the 9/11 Commission, maybe. In the summer of 2004, the Commission concluded that the government's principal failure was to, quote, connect the dots. In other words, America's intelligence agencies, whether it was the FBI or the CIA, had much of the information they needed, but failed to put the pieces together. The Commission also recommended a number of reforms designed to prevent similar failures in the future, including increased cooperation between agencies. Did they work, or is our intelligence community as ill-prepared as they were 20 years ago? Here to help answer that question is former U.S. Army Reserve Lieutenant Colonel and the president of the London Center for Policy Research, Tony Shaffer. Tony, always good to see you.
Always great to have the opportunity to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
So if we're doing a sort of 20-year retrospective here, what were the intelligence failures that led to 9/11? And now 20 years later, have they been addressed in a meaningful way in your expert opinion, Tony?
So the answer is from the Afghan failure? No, apparently not. We are literally at the beginning of the end, so to speak, of where we started 20 years ago. We have allowed the Taliban to be as powerful as ever. And I would argue that the things that we saw happen in Afghanistan are indicative of the system that is completely broken or compromised. Not to say that there are not people like you and I still in the system who are willing to say, this is the objective truth, this is what we need to act on. The problem is you and I are minorities. Generally speaking, the politicians who take the intelligence want a specific outcome to reinforce their thinking, not information that may undermine what they want to do. So I would argue the same set of problems that happened before 9/11 that resulted in the 9/11 attacks are obviously still right in front of us, because much of this problem before 9/11 was not the dots. We could identify the dots. It was the policy that prevented us from connecting those dots. And I think that's exactly where we're still at today.
So if we look at some of the reforms made right after 9/11, and now they've played out over 20 years. I mean, the creation of NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, right? The enormous expansion in what is now DHS, the Department of Homeland, its creation, but also folding other agencies into it. It feels a little bit like a huge amount of bureaucratic expansion and reshuffling. Has there been any aspect of that you point to and say, it looks like they really implemented, from just a government management perspective, lessons learned in a way that makes us safer now 20 years later?
Well, let's walk through exactly what you just said, Buck. They created the Department of Homeland Security, which is redundant to the FBI, Department of Defense, and other agencies. So you created a huge bureaucracy that always looks for things to do. The DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, is another bureaucracy on top of other massive bureaucracies. There has been no efficiencies created and large new bureaucracies there to make things more difficult. So the answer is no. All these quote unquote reforms simply added to the complexity of the challenges of the environment before 9/11. And now, instead of being able to streamline things and get information to where you need it, you've increased the likelihood of failure. And NCTC, Buck, I know people who work there. You have everybody in the same room, but everybody works in their same lanes they've always worked. If you worked with CIA, you focus on CIA. If you work for FBI, it's nothing has changed. And by the way, there's no incentive to change. No one has actually broken down the walls between these larger bureaucracies. And by building bureaucracies on top of bureaucracies, you've made a massive maze that's difficult for anyone to operate within to be effective.
What do you think would be some ways, I mean, speaking about what isn't working, right? We've certainly covered a little bit of ground when it comes to how it's an expanded bureaucracy. There's still, as you point out, a lot of redundancies, and a lot of time is spent at these agencies. And I know, having been at the CIA, fighting with the other agencies about who gets 2 minutes in the Oval Office with the president or whatever the case may be. It's honestly kind of sad and ridiculous that adults are squabbling in the way that they do, but that is what ends up happening a lot of the time. How can we make the intel community better, not just so that we have a leaner, more efficient government, Tony, but so we don't get hit again like we did on 9/11?
So, I mean, this may sound strange, but I've talked to Jim Woolsey, the former director of CIA, who I met while I was running operations. I didn't always appreciate the way CIA ran it, but when he was the director of Central Intelligence, he kind of had a belly button you could go to get things coordinated. So I almost long for the days of DOD and CIA kind of ruling the roost. Instead, now you have these other agencies which all pretend to be able to do clandestine stuff, and it's massively complex without any idea of who's actually in charge. And I would argue, based on what I'm seeing right now regarding Afghanistan, no agency can actually go and tell you or me or the president how many people are still in Afghanistan, what's going on with the Pakistani ISI. Nobody has a handle on all of that, because you have so many agencies overlapping and deciding to do what they do. And the end result is a mosaic of chaos. So I would say let's go back to look at how things were successful back in the 70s and 80s. We did have some good successes. We had some failures too. But the idea would be is that you need to have single points of authority to kind of coordinate and direct activities. And then the other thing, Buck, I'll be blunt, budget control. Nothing gets a bureaucrat's attention quicker than saying, I'm going to cut your budget if you don't do what I tell you to do. And I think that was the hugest mistake. If they're going to do the DNI, they should have given budget control to that DNI so that that person would have had real authority over how bureaucrats rule their roost, which is by money. And by the way, President Trump never learned this lesson either, by the way. Just saying that budgetary control is the one thing that's key to making any bureaucracy toe the line and do what you needed to do. Those are the
Tony,
things I would actually do.
If we're looking now, again, this 20-year horizon, 20-year anniversary of 9/11, is the intelligence community better prepared today in substantive ways than we were 20 years ago?
There's no doubt, Buck, that they're better funded, they're better resourced. But I would argue it's like a builder, a gal building up huge muscles, but cannot actually do much. And I think that's what we have now. If I were going to go in, I would cut all agencies by a half regarding personnel. I would cut their budgets by at least a third. And I would bet money I would create efficiencies you've never saw before, because you would get rid of the bureaucracy and get back on tasks. So the tasks of doing the hard analysis, of making good assessments, and the hard work of being an operator, doing the things that you need to collect information, those are the things we should get back to the basics on, and not this refining and regurgitation, rehashing of information that bureaucrats tend to do as it works its way from the field all the way up to the White House.
I still remember, Tony, sitting in meetings in the CIA where people would argue over the wording of an unimportant sentence.
I know.
With
Me too.
ferocity. I mean, as if the fate of the free world hung on whether we said however or but in the start of a PDB. It's just crazy. But anyway, Good to see you, Tony. Thanks for being with us. Appreciate the expertise.
Thank you for having me.
They called it the Coalition of the Willing. 20 years ago, dozens of nations formed a united front in an effort to root out Islamic terrorists. But 2 decades later, that international support appears to have frayed. When we come back, former Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney, Stephen Yates, will join us to discuss how America's standing in the world has evolved since the attacks of September 11th.
This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Then President George W. Bush delivering arguably the most memorable remarks in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks. Shortly thereafter, much of the international community rallied in support of what would come to be known as the global war on terror. Alongside the U.S., the United Kingdom, France, NATO members, and dozens of other nations assisted in targeting extremist groups like Al-Qaeda throughout the Muslim world. But 20 years later, what was once called the Coalition of the Willing appears fractured. Rather than presenting a united front against rogue states and terrorist organizations, the U.S. finds itself often at odds with nations like Russia and China when it comes to Middle East policy. So what have the last 20 years meant for America's standing in the world, and how has it affected our ability to combat terrorism? Here to help us answer that question is former Deputy National Security Advisor to former Vice President Dick Cheney and CEO of DC International Advisory, Stephen Yates. Stephen, thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Buck. Great to join you.
Let's take us back to the days immediately following the September 11th attacks. How did the Bush White House go about putting together a coalition to combat terrorism? What did that look like?
Well, there are a lot of pieces of it. I mean, you have to remember that people working in the White House and doing these national security jobs are also human beings. They had to process an awful lot of shocking imagery that we'd hoped never to ever see on American soil. in Washington, D.C., New York, and the memorial site that would come to be Shanksville. There's just so much that that was unknown. When we got people back into the White House right after 9/11, there were sort of the group of people that were put into what I would consider the white hot zone of looking at the counterterrorism mission, the broader Middle East, the war preparation movement. And then there were those who were put in what were maybe the arc of uncertainty, the places that needed policy adjustments in light of what had happened. But really, in an instant, our entire foreign policy had been reshuffled. It's hard to even imagine what the 2000 election campaign debate was like on foreign policy, but there was strategic competition towards China, sort of a revised relationship with Russia and India. And this just sort of pushed everything aside and made terrorism number one. And all of our global relationships were redefined by the fight against terrorism, the movement of counterterrorism finance, and also a number of things related to counterproliferation. Those completely took over every element of foreign policy. It took several months, not just with the war in Afghanistan, but also with these other priorities to filter through the system and reframe relationships in the national security sphere.
I mean, nations like Russia and China, Stephen, were in those early days after 9/11 partners. Is that fair to say in the war on terror at some level? I mean, how useful were they as allies against groups like Al-Qaeda, and has that really lasted at all to the present day?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of theories about what cooperation in the international realm means. I mean, you and I have probably different opinions and experiences than a lot of people who write about this stuff endlessly. But in the early days after the attacks, there was kind of a big kumbaya moment through the international community. I put in air quotes. I mean, we had NATO invoking Article 5. There was tremendous solidarity from old Europe, New Europe, all of the world towards the United States at that moment. And so in that early time, powers like Russia and China were very cautious because, with good reason, historically, every bully or tyrant should be afraid of an American awoken by an attack. And so when there's really no power like us in the world once aroused to a cause, and it sure seemed like America hit like this was going to punch back very, very hard. And they were very determined to make sure it wasn't at them. So there were lots of positive sounds. But it basically changed the priorities to pursuit of cooperation, to get things through the United Nations Security Council and UN organizations for this global remit that we thought would get more partners and allies on board. I think there's a lot we can kind of gauge, critique, and measure in the years that followed. But in that moment, it was hard to argue with the rationality of the president and others saying, well, if cooperation is on offer, why wouldn't we take it? Of course, some of these powers cynically immediately wanted to use it for their own purposes. So we started hearing from China about terrorism from the Muslim Uyghur population and from the Russians about Chechens and other groups. So very quickly, these powers learned how to use this way of thinking against us, too.
Stephen, how has the recent Biden administration withdrawal from Afghanistan, in your mind, has it changed the view that the world will have in cooperating with the U.S. going forward, especially on the global anti-terrorism, counterterrorism mission?
It has. I mean, basically, you have the bookends of the era that you highlighted at the outset of how we got into this, which was we got hit, and then from a position of profound power and strength, punched back. Now, what we did with that power, anyone can assess in the years that followed. But the other bookend is this, I think, retreat and withdrawal from Afghanistan that showed profound weakness. And so those who put their lot with us, risked their lives, their fortunes, their families, all they believed in to work with us, stand with us, maybe for their own benefit, but they made that bet. It's very, very hard to get people to believe that bet again going forward. Should something like another 9/11 happen, should a cause like a terrorist regime needing to be toppled ever come up again. And so if you just look at human history and say, well, that's never going to be needed again, then you don't worry. But if you take the sort of darker view of humanity, that these kinds of things come and go, and we're going to need people to do things that we can't do ourselves in the future, that was completely kind of spit away, shall we speak, in the way this withdrawal took place. And aggressors have taken note, and they'll be pushing the envelope in their own spheres now.
Are we, Stephen, in a better or worse position, would you say, than we were 20 years ago when it just comes to the international cooperation needed for the fight against terrorism?
I think we're far worse. And part of that, I think, goes from somewhat of the mission creep of we're rallying an amazing military force where if someone does something terrible to us or to an ally, we'll destroy that target. To the trying to rebuild in our own image and all the critiques that came from all of that, it muddied the waters and it makes it harder for people to know what they're going to sign on to and for how long. But the abandonment of people and the abandonment of things that were worth the loss of blood and treasure, I think, is actually the more chilling signal that goes out to the world, that America can't be relied upon to endure to the end against these foes. And so maybe we can't afford to stand with the Americans.
Stephen, always appreciate your perspective and expertise, my friend. Good to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Buck. Take care.
All right, that's all the time we have for this special edition of Hold the Line. I'd like to thank my guests, Bernard Carrick, Bill Roggio, Tony Schaefer, and Stephen Yates, for sharing their expertise and experiences. Have a good night, and as always, shields high.